Magic the Gathering cards are outpacing S&P 500 if you buy smart. And in today's video, we'll talk about how to look at Magic the Gathering's rotation system and how you can take advantage of it. Let's start with talking about how the rotation works in Standard, Magic the Gathering's most competitive format. Standard encompasses the most recent sets, and as the new set gets printed, it is legal in Standard. However, because it's not ever growing, at some point, given the current cadence and it changes year to years, a portion of the previous sets gets rotated out, stops being legal, then Standard pool of sets shortens, and then again, every new set increases the pool of sets legal. And so why does that matter? Well, it's actually particularly important because, as you can imagine, there are a couple of things happening here, because let's imagine some card A, which is very good, right? So we've got a given Standard format, and then this card is set to be released in the next set, the newest set. And so people thinking it's going to be really good, they tend to hype up the card, especially now in the social media era and content creators. There's a lot of hype going on. At some point, the card that gets actually printed gets into the decks that it would actually be played in. People actually validate whether the card is really good, and let's say it is. Then a rotation comes, and then the card gets pushed out of the Standard format, and then people ask themselves whether it's played anywhere else really, or it was just played in that Standard format. This is how it's going to work, right? New card, pop into the format, and get popped out. Now, why does it matter for us? Well, it's particularly important because in practice, when it comes to prices of cards, you can imagine again that this card A, before the release, is going to, in these pre-order prices, it's typically going to be very, very high, or at least higher than you would expect. And then it will somehow plateau at some level, because we actually know what the demand is going to be, because it actually gets into the format and we see how much it's played. So it kind of solidifies its position at a given price X, and it stays there until something changes, supply or demand. Well, the easiest way to lose demand is when it gets rotated out of Standard, right? Because people know it's going to get rotated out, typically sometime before the actual rotation, some people are going to start to liquidate the card, are trying to try to sell it because they know it's going to be worthless for them. And so you will start seeing a small drip in the price, right? Small drop, slowly and slowly. And then when the actual rotation comes, well, people will unload the card en masse, especially if it was actually very good and very popular and very expensive, because a lot of people will try to unload the card at the same time, and the price will absolutely crash, right? So the price crashes, and then we wait another, let's say a couple of months. So we actually are perfectly sure that this card is kind of bad, and nobody plays it, and it's typically going to be then that it's at the lowest of its price, and then who knows? It might stay at that level, or it might increase because people actually find other uses for the card. And a typical use for a card like that is Commander, which is an internal format, multiplayer format, and very different cards are popular in Commander than they would be in one-on-one Magic, competitive Magic. Some cards might or might not actually find homes in Commander. And then if they do, people will pick up on it, and slowly but surely the price will start picking up, because we will find that there is actually new demand that wasn't there in the first place. And so what should you do with that information? What you could do is try to find a card that's particularly cheap relative to its potential value, let's say at the brink or after the rotation, right? Where the people have unloaded the card and price has completely dropped. And then if you have identified that this might actually see play in Commander and it doesn't just yet, then you might have yourself a pretty gold miney card, or cards plural. And because some players might have already picked up on the fact that a card is good in Commander, because it might have been very good to begin with, at which point the phenomenon won't really apply as well. But if they don't, and you see a potential there, you might buy it and hold it for probably good months or years even, for the EDH players to really pick it up, and then you reap the rewards. That is, of course, unless there are reprints, and that is, of course, unless those reprints actually affect the price in a meaningful way. Because there's another thing to this, which is WotC does have power of reprinting cards, and then if they do, you might be in for some bad time. Now, and an additional kicker is if you find a card that's, for example, mythic rare, rather than rare or uncommon, and then it's from a relatively small / unopened set, because it means that the supply is relatively low, right? So you might combine the powers of low supply and then try to take advantage of a demand that is going to be there in the future but isn't just yet. Now let's take a look at a couple of examples of what actually has happened to illustrate all of the points I've made here, and all of them show the same thing but from a bit of a different perspective. Let's take a look at Anointed Procession, for example, a card that cost about around $10 at the brink of its rotation and just after didn't really dip that much. So it's a bit of a different story, you might say, but then if you had actually bought it back then, well, you would be in a lot of luck, because if you hold it for long enough, you see the rewards. This card was and still is a banger in EDH, and those $10 or $6 you may have put in would have increased tenfold, with the card now worth $60, actual 60. Now it has accumulated over time. If you had bought it back then, you would have seen the rewards coming over the coming years. Another example of a similar story but a bit different is Smothering Tithe, because yet again we start very relatively low, right, at 10ish bucks. If you hold it, it does increase fourfold. So you think, okay, I'm good, awesome. But then they reprint the card, and the card drops yet again down to like 1820-ish, so the price halves. Now, given the original price, you still would have made a profit, but then, if you'd been staunched and steadfast enough to hold it still, it increases yet again, because the demand outpaces the new supply even, and it climbs over the previous price point of $40. That's yet another very curious example of how that can work. Another example would be the Scarab God, which is currently one of the most popular EDH cards because it's one of the strongest Dimir commanders in Commander. So one could think that it would have increased in price substantially. No, it hasn't. But because, I mean, it did, but it then dropped because of a reprint. So if you had seen the reprint coming, you should have unloaded before one. And if you had, then you would have made quite a bit of buck, because the price of the card kind of skyrocketed to like 40 during its standard era. Then it dropped back to like 10 or 15. And if you had picked it up then you could have unloaded it a bit later when it doubled. However, that was the point to do it, because then the reprints came and now you can buy the card at like $6. And a completely different example, but Glorybringer, a card absolutely excellent for one-on-one play, and in standard, indeed, this rare would have cost you about $10. Then it got rotated out, and the price bottomed out at trivial, $1 type of deal, which is very tempting to just buy up, because why not $1? And then you would not have seen too much of a return, if any, on this, because it just isn't a good EDH card, and that actually requires a bit of EDH specific knowledge to know that this type of effect, while possibly popular with some casual, bracket 1 and 2 dragon gamers, in general, you wouldn't see it in a generic red deck too much. And that's another thing that's really important, because a card like Smothering Tithe would definitely see a lot of play in generic white decks compared to Glorybringer, which is both narrow and also just kind of mid, because this effect doesn't really capitalize on the multiplayer nature of the format. And so this would be an example that if you had bought the card in its kind of price trough, you'd have been punished very severely. And so if you do want to outpace S&P 500 with Magic singles, you have to approach it pretty smart. You have to find a card that shows nice EDH potential, but doesn't have it, at least just yet. And so if you spot that card with potential, but not much demand eyes on it just yet, wait until the price drops post-rotation, buy it up, and then after you hold it for an appropriate amount of time, you can unload it with very happy profit. If you want to get to know more stories like this, drop us a like, share, and follow, a subscription on top of that. And I will see you next time. Cheers.